Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're this in 2 languages. How many, or you are English speakers only?
No, entonces explico.
Only, English speakers only. So we can switch to Spanish, if you may allow us, Mr. Shannon. Muy bien. Pienso que el
I think that Vice President Joe Biden has set the tone for today's discussion and has left us at a good point with his introductory message and his overview of the challenges faced in the region and for its development. But I would like to give you a brief overview of the theme of this panel, which is 20 years of CAF Conference in Washington and the Inter-American Dialogue, and what we can expect in the near future. 20 years ago, our region was immersed in the process of open economies, neoliberalism, high unemployment, high crime rates, and going through a transition towards democracy in several countries and the strengthening of institutions, which still continues to this day. And there was a very poor infrastructure. And we're still setting ourselves back to that time that we're facing the challenge of having more and better education over these past 20 years. We've seen how our region has become more integrated into subregions and how programs of major social investments have lifted millions of people out of poverty, and also how the region has empowered its people not only to demand more civil and human rights, but also to protest the corruption that Vice President Biden mentioned. But the region also began to elect left-leaning governments, 21st century socialists, and with this movement to the left in political terms, the region also in the recent years experienced an increase in revenue because of increased prices of raw materials, and they invested in social programs, and also there was growth in our economies. There was major investment in infrastructure, and demand from China helped that growth and increased revenue accelerate. But since the drop in commodity prices, that party of economic growth has come to an end. And this also has marked the beginning of the fall of some governments. At least it means more center and center-right governments have been elected. Social programs have been affected, and some corruption scandals came to life on an unprecedented scale in some of our countries. And crime has continued to be one of the biggest issues concerning the region. The 21st century socialism, with the drop in oil prices, also began to wane. We also see that this is a model. Well, for some of these, there has been a problem with the lack of a good standard of living in Venezuela, and also flaws in their institutions, and more center-right governments were elected. Also, the world began to celebrate the normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba, and we are celebrating the imperfect peace agreement in Colombia, as the president himself describes it. And we see these challenges of corruption, citizen security, and a good management of our natural resources in a region that is trying to compete on a world scale and which needs to do more than sell its raw materials, and is trying to sell added value and to get on the wave of innovation through better education in our region. So with this introduction, I'd like to introduce you to our very distinguished guests. First, we have the former president of Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla, and U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Ambassador Thomas Shannon. Mr. Nelson Jobim, who is the former Defense and Justice Minister of Brazil. We also have a former Defense and Trade Minister and presidential candidate from Colombia, Marta Lucía Ramírez. We also have Allan Wagner, who is the former Foreign Affairs and Defense Minister of Peru, and Félix Peña, who is the director of the Institute of International Trade in the ICBC Foundation. So we welcome you all and thank you for being with us today. We have a little bit less than an hour. Let's see whether we can have 45 minutes of presentations, and then we'll give you a chance for questions and answers. So I hope you can be brief in your remarks. And now we give the floor to the former president of Costa Rica, Chinchilla, whose message touches on the issue of Central American integration. Thank you very much, Patricia, and a very good afternoon to everyone. By way of introduction to this discussion that I am certain will be quite enriching because of it's enriched by the person who spoke before me, we would like to give recognition to the fact that never before has our region been so highly integrated. This is true both in the area of trade and investments, and also in terms of political dialogue. If we do a brief review, we go through the first generation instruments, we look at the common markets, and later these tied into the free trade agreements. And in the last 20 years, perhaps if we cut it off after the first Summit of the Americas in 1994, we can see how the process of trade and investment integration became more dynamic. And we have to add to this the importance of the support given by a whole set of regional institutions to supporting this agenda. However, acknowledging this situation, which is quite promising for our region, I would just add that, however, the agreements and integration tools that we've made progress with are not necessarily in and of themselves guarantors of a promising future, nor does this guarantee that the processes of integration in Latin America will develop further. For this reason, I believe that we are at an important conjuncture in which we need to rethink an agenda that will enable us to renew these processes of integration. So that we can go through a renewal with the integration processes. And so I would first say that this is because there are some warnings out there that we should underscore. And in addition, it seems to me that with a renewed Latin American integration agenda, we also have an obligation to stress certain conditions that need to accompany this process in the future. Now, in terms of one warning, I think that many of you will agree with me that the integration processes, in light of the recent lessons and events that we've seen, we cannot say that they are irreversible. The Brexit and growing nationalism in Europe, as well as positions that go beyond this, such as the TPP and the TTIP, do show that, in fact, sometimes there are situations that cause us to pause and think about these integration processes. The case of Europe is the most eloquent example. For the past 5 years, the citizens of Europe have been losing faith in the European Union, and this process has not yet been turned around. In Latin America, we see some warning signs. First, there is discourse in the United States elections campaign here in the north, which questions the validity of such agreements as NAFTA, or it may seem that the balance that we struck in the past in favor of trade and trade agreements might be weakened in coming years. And if we look at what's happening in the South, although right now we do not have any polls telling us how the Latin American citizens view integration. We can say that there are some similarities in terms of economic, social, and political events in terms of what preceded the Brexit in Europe. I'm referring to a slowdown of the economy and the significant social impact of this, and another thing that is there, which is a disenchantment of certain sectors of the citizenry with government institutions. And if national institutions, government institutions become delegitimized, then this also carries over to supranational institutions. So this means that there are some things that are imperative to think about if we want to have a renewed integration process in our region. And the first is to strengthen the processes of integration within our own countries, within our own nations. The mechanisms we have designed in Latin America have leaned more towards the creation of attractive platforms to make it possible to successfully compete for investments. ECLAC has told us, as well as other international institutions, that intra-regional trade in Latin America is relatively much smaller than what is found in other parts of the world. So there is a very big agenda in terms of facilitating trade, and we really need to become wedded to this. And we also see that it's a matter of aspiring to more. It's a matter of trying to do quite more than what the Alliance for Progress is showing us. This alliance describes itself as deep integration of the economies of its partners. The second element that I would suggest is also to have a big mea culpa, because we see this from the region. We need to acknowledge this, that we have been more successful in promoting the integration of our countries with the international economy, but we still have a big job to be done in terms of integrating our own societies. We know very well that the inequalities, even though in recent years we have diminished them, are still there, and they're dragging down our efforts at development, but also integration. And because there are the losers who are pitted against those who cannot perceive the benefits of the integration. We have to do something about this. In Latin America, our citizens are much more proactive. They stand up for themselves. So we're not talking about the traditional idea of integrated societies in which all citizens may feel that they are reaping the benefits of these processes. Rather, we're talking about shared societies. In other words, societies in which citizens' opinions begin to be heard because they are demanding a bigger role to play in the concert of nations. And the last element that I would like to underscore to wrap this up, to wrap up this introduction, as one of the indispensable conditions is to remind ourselves that democracy matters. After the harsh experiences that we have seen in some of our countries of our region, you cannot clothe yourselves in the rules of the majorities. When you have elections, you cannot ignore the basic guarantees of any democracy, such as freedom, respect for human rights, and the need to strengthen the rule of law. When we talk about how we got to where we are over these last 20 years, it was not only because there was a big consensus about the importance of trade and clear rules for investment and promoting economic growth, but also because 20 years ago, we were celebrating that beautiful Latin American spring of democracy. This is something that we have, a job we have not completed, and we need to work now much more decisively, not only in the OAS and not only in Mercosur, but from many other entities. We need to pave the way to democracy and say that democracy is a sine qua non requirement to moving towards better relations and growth in Latin America. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. So you've left this at a key point. You have to talk about democracy. And this is a good segue to hearing from Ambassador Shannon, who will tell us a bit about his impressions from recent trips to Venezuela. I know that you've traveled through the Middle East, a region that is in much more upheaval than our region, but it would be good for you to share with us the result of the dialogue that the United States has undertaken or tried to undertake with Venezuela to ensure there's respect for democracy and democratic institutions to emerge from the crisis in Venezuela, which seems to grow worse every day. Thank you very much, Patricia. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's see if we could help Mr. Shannon with his microphone.
Otherwise, I can share my microphone with him.
Mejor.
Is that better? Good. Thank you very much, Patricia, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to take part in this CAF event. It's an important one, and it is important that we acknowledge the importance of the work done by CAF, especially in the Andean countries, but now it's become a benchmark for all countries of the hemisphere. It's important also to acknowledge the important work done by Enrique Garcia. Now, I feel pleased to be here with my distinguished colleagues on this panel, but to speak after Vice President Biden is not an easy task. I don't have his eloquence. I don't have his experience. Pero lo que tengo...
Or interpretation in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So I'll switch to English at this point. The question, of course, is about democracy, and as President Chinchilla noted, democracy counts. Democracy matters. And it remains a focal point of how the United States engages in the hemisphere, but also how the hemisphere engages with itself. And what's striking and important about what Vice President Biden said is that we understand ourselves now as part of a hemisphere and not apart from it. And how we engage with our partners in the hemisphere and how our partners engage with each other will define in many ways the future of this hemisphere and the well-being of our peoples. And this requires not just clear-eyed understandings of the challenges we face, whether they be political, social, or economic, but it also requires acts of solidarity that are going to define how our peoples and our societies relate to each other. And as we engage with Venezuela, we engage with a nation, with a people that has been a partner of ours for decades, and with whom we have had a diverse, sometimes complicated and difficult relationship, but one that has never broken at several key points, whether it be in energy or other areas of endeavor. And we have always sought to find a way to protect it and always sought to find a way to continue our engagement broadly with Venezuela, with the government when possible, but broadly with the people and the society. And as this administration came into office, it sought to find a new basis or pattern for its relationship with Venezuela. This has not been easy, as you can imagine, for any number of reasons. But we have continued in our effort to maintain open dialogue, to ensure that our missions in both countries, although they're not represented at an ambassadorial level, remain open and functioning, and that to the extent possible we continue our relationships based on energy and commerce. In my engagements in Venezuela, our purpose has been largely to show that we are capable of having a conversation with all sides of Venezuelan politics and Venezuelan society. Because as Venezuela gets deeper into its political crisis, as we see political power fracture and fragment, as we see a people increasingly desperate for a governance that can address their immediate concerns, it is evident that only Venezuelans can address these problems. Only Venezuelans can find a way out of this crisis. But they're not going to do it alone. They are going to require the help and solidarity of an entire region. And this is a region that has different kinds of relationships with Venezuela and can bring all those, the diversity of those relationships to bear. And so from our point of view, it is important, first, for us to stand up for our own political values. Secondly, to be clear about what we expect from all of our partners in regard to democracy and human rights, but at the same time recognizing that we have to engage and we have to have dialogue that addresses all aspects of our relationship and sends a clear message to Venezuela that they have a future in a democratic Americas, and that with the resources and the potential that Venezuela has, it can be an important and meaningful member of our hemispheric community. And so at the end of the day, our concerns about Venezuelan democracy are well known. Our concerns about the political crisis are well known. Our concerns about prisoners being held for political reasons are well known. But I will underscore that we are committed to a dialogue process, and we are committed to doing all we can to help Venezuela find a way out of its current political crisis and back into the larger community of American nations.
Let me just do a follow-up question. What kind of role the United States can play now in Venezuela, if any, to get out of this gridlock? I mean, a confrontation between the Asamblea Nacional and the judicial system. So nobody is respecting the decisions of each other, and that takes the crisis to another level.
One of the striking things about the Americas is that political battles are no longer fought in the jungles or on the streets. They're fought in institutions. And we're seeing in Venezuela a political battle for power that has had an enormous consequences on Venezuelan institutions. And again, the question isn't what can the United States do to help Venezuela get out of this crisis, because at the end of the day, it's going to depend on Venezuelans, and it's going to depend on the degree to which their institutions can respond to their immediate needs and their desires. But in this regard, this is really about how the hemisphere helps Venezuela. And this was, again, the larger message of Vice President Biden's speech today. This is a hemisphere of extraordinary future. This is a hemisphere of extraordinary potential. And it's one that has shown an ability to address extraordinary political challenges, and we've just seen an example of it in Colombia with the negotiation of a peace agreement between the FARC and the government. And we have seen the ability of democratic institutions address profound social inequities. So these institutions, if allowed to, can address the political crisis inside of Venezuela today. The Vice President had his suggestions about this, especially in regard to a recall referendum and the importance of opening a path and a space for the Venezuelan people to express themselves. But for this to happen, the hemisphere needs to speak.
Bueno, ya lo está haciendo, empezando por el secretario general.
That is already happening, beginning with the Secretary General, with different former presidents that are grouped in different international organizations. So all of this is coming to a head at a time where the international community has come to realize that they would like to see the president of Venezuela out of government. So we don't know if that referendum will be authorized now or for next year. I would like to call on Nelson Jobim, because we also have seen a recent crisis in Brazil, a crisis that many say is due to an economic recession after a boom growth. And I wonder, this crisis or this political trial of former President Dilma Rousseff, is this going to open the doors for a dialogue amongst all sectors? It is a tremendous challenge that has to be faced by the entire country, not only to overcome the political crisis, but also to leave the economic crisis behind. Is this the result of that decline in the 21st century socialism that for many years they tried to export?
The first thing we have to see is Well, this idea that the mechanism that played out in Brazil was a coup, and this message ended up sinking in and having a certain influence, because when you assert that there was a coup d'etat, it's important to understand how things actually did happen. Because to say something is a coup, it's a judgment over the facts, and we really have to discuss the facts that underlie this accusation. I want to just go through the impeachment process in Brazil that transpired over the course of this year. You've got the 2015 report made of December of 2015, in which the case was brought, in which the President of the Republic was accused of having opened up or accessed credit or taken out loans without the authorization of the National Congress, without the necessary authorization. And these are state financial organizations that these loans were taken from. And this was to give the impression of a financial situation of the country that really wasn't borne out in fact. And so what we have is, it's difficult to understand these impeachable crimes and to set them apart from common crimes. Now, the Senate and the lower house initiated this process or trial, and after the defense brought by the president, 375 votes were in favor, 376 votes in favor of impeachment. In April the 25th, the special committee was established in the Congress, and on the 20th of April, the hearings started to be held, both by the prosecutorial forces and the defense. On the 29th, the Minister of Justice, Cardoso and Barbosa, and Katia Abreu, who was the Minister of Agriculture, they made their case. On June 5th, the opinion of the Congress's issued its opinion on the trial, and in May, we had the 55, there was a plenary that was held whereby 55 votes ruled in favor of the moving forward. Now, June 1st, the defense made its case and brought all of its witnesses. Now, on the 8th to the 29th of June, the Senate heard two witnesses brought by the prosecutors, 23 defense witnesses, and additional defense witnesses, and the president, that is President of the Supreme Court of Justice, called for a hearing of 4 more witnesses to speak. Now, there was a group that was appointed by the Senate to look into the evidence presented, and there were opinions issued regarding the defense presented to look into the complex issues of the case. Now, the President of the Republic, in writing, sent in by the Solicitor General, Eduardo Cardoso, sent in its defense. And then the final allegations of the prosecution were issued, and then on the 28th, that is 7 days before, the final defense was made. Now, the rapporteur expressed his view, and then there was the it was decided that the case would be presented. Then the prosecutorial or the accusation was brought, the indictment rather, and then the defense was presented. On August 25th, the actual trial started. Now, during this whole period, during this trial, which lasted until August 31st, 18 different procedural issues were raised and decided by the President of the Senate, rather the President of the Supreme Court of Justice who presided over the case. There were witness testimony taken, reports issued, and the President of the Republic also spoke. And this was an 11-hour and 37-minute interrogation, or rather witness testimony taken by the President. She responded to questions asked by 48 different senators. Then there were the oral debates in the plenary of the Senate. 73 senators spoke for 15 minutes each about the charges brought and the defense as well. Now, the case itself is in 7 different volumes of 24,000 pages. Now, so finally, the plenary of the Senate decided that there would have to be 2 votes held. First, whether to find her guilty or not, and whether that would lead to the loss of her mandate, and a second one, which would be whether her future political rights would be terminated. Now, 61 votes to 20 ruled in favor of her being removed. And then the sanction of the termination of her political rights, there were 42 in favor of her losing her political rights, 36 against, and 3 abstentions. As there wasn't a 2/3 majority vote, then her political rights in the future were not terminated. So to close, I would say that the problem of whether there was an impeachable crime committed or not. Now, the Constitution defines that an impeachable crime are those acts of the President of the Republic that go against the federal state, especially the budget law. And that was the accusation brought. Now, the second charge was, and this in Article 167, called for, talks about taking out supplementary or special debt loans without the authorization of the Congress and without supplementary funds to back it. Now, the law also defines as an impeachable crime that complements the Constitution, mindful of the constitutional authorization, says that to authorize taking out loans without abiding by the budget law and there not being any statute of limitation against that. Now, and also the amortization of this loan and the setting up of a reserve to annul the effect of these loans being taken out, and that this was counter to the law. Just to sum up, now, to taking out loans without being backed by the law. Now, after this long discussion, the Senate understood that she was guilty, and that's why she was removed from office. Now, this issue of her losing her future political rights, that was also discussed in the Supreme Court, whether it would be possible for this vote to be held separately. Now, given the facts of the case, the issue was whether where it is accurate to say that a coup was carried out. Now, the fact is, all of the rules were followed. Now, to say that this is a coup d'etat was simply an attempt to establish, to say that this impeachment process was a coup which would show Brazil in a poor light.
De su sistema judicial, no solamente para lidiar.
Not only in terms of dealing with the scandal of Petrobras that has caused several public servants and entrepreneurs to be put behind bars, but also this has been important because of the trial of President Dilma Rousseff. And that is why I would ask this question of the minister from Colombia on the peace process. It will be voted on the 2nd of October. This is a plebiscite where Colombians have to vote yes or no in terms of the agreement negotiated by the government of Colombia with the FARC. And there is a lot of concern amongst a lot of the population. A lot of the people in Colombia do not agree with the way in which justice is going to be done, where these people have been accused of crimes against humanity. So, in response to that question, Minister, you live in Colombia. We are a few weeks away. So how is the campaign going with a view to this plebiscite? And how is the debate going in terms of what has already been negotiated? And it could be renegotiated, as was just said by the former President Chinchilla. She was talking about the trade agreements. But could that happen with the FARC?
Well, first, I wish to thank the CAF and Mike Shifter of the Inter-American Dialogue for this invitation. After looking at the picture, I remember that Tango Felix, and where it says that 20 years is nothing. Well, 20 years again is nothing, but we looked a lot younger there. We see Mike and Enrique like a couple of rock stars back then, and that really does make us excited about the coming 20 years. Well, Colombia. Colombia is without a doubt going through the most important time right now. The peace process and the referendum is the most important news in our country in recent years. But hopefully, this is the most positive news that Colombia has had in recent years. Unfortunately, that is not true. And it's not true because the negotiations with the FARC took place within a process of increasingly apparent polarization, which makes it ever more difficult to overcome. And polarization is precisely over what Patricia has said. Many of us believe that democracy must have justice, and justice must have democracy. We can't simply talk about an apparent peace for a given period of time that places our democracy at severe risk. We often are looking at Venezuela, and in my personal case, we are afraid to look in that mirror because the agreement with the FARC has some definitely positive things. It's very positive to lay down their arms. It's very positive for them to recognize our institutions, but it also has negative things, such as, for example, serious crimes against humanity, recruitment of children as young as 11 years old that didn't take place 20 years ago, but right now during the negotiations process, rape of women, forced abortions in the jungles, anti-personnel landmines. Unfortunately, all of these serious crimes may remain in impunity. And I say they remain with impunity because we don't have the concept of justice there. Fortunately, we have our prosecutor here, and this is someone who does provide many guarantees that he will do everything possible to ensure that the prosecutor's office will be an essential instrument to ensure that there is real justice. But what is set forth in the agreement is not enough justice. It's insufficient. Why? Because they're only going to judge the people who are primarily responsible for the serious crimes. Secondly, because the sanctions imposed for those serious crimes are not determined within Colombian criminal law. We do not have what was included in this agreement, where the sanction or the punishment is restriction on freedom of residence. This means that you can't leave Washington here, you can't leave Cartagena. I think that criminals would be happy of that if they get just limited to Cartagena for 5 or 6 years. So that's the first point in terms of the definition of justice. But in my view, what's most worrisome is that in our current constitution, someone who has been convicted for crimes may not participate in the political process, may not be elected as a politician. But this agreement expressly states that those who have been placed on trial by the special system of justice under the agreement between the Santos government government and the FARC will not have any limits placed on their ability to participate in politics. So that affects our understanding of democracy. What does Colombia deserve? It deserves a real peace, but it also deserves to have an increasingly improved democracy. The only thing that can ensure that we have progress, well-being, and freedom in our country is that democracy. When this agreement allows those people who have been responsible for crimes against humanity to participate in the political process without any restrictions, this goes hand in hand with another part of the agreement, which is drug trafficking. Drug trafficking that Colombia has suffered from so much, and actually all of Latin America, but in Colombia it's been a bit more apparent than in other countries. But what's happening here? The FARC is responsible for at least 70% of the drug trafficking business. Through drug trafficking, they've taken in enormous revenue, but also from other illegal activities such as kidnapping, extortion, illegal mining that is causing tremendous damage to our environment. And all of the resources that the FARC has gained are what they're going to use to run their political campaigns, because the agreement has no rules preventing or that forces the FARC to return those resources. And I repeat, it's great that the prosecutor of Colombia is here, because is going to say, I hope, he said that I'm going to go after the FARC's resources. I applaud that. However, the agreement does not expressly state that the FARC has to say what resources they have and turn them over. It's not fair to allow them to run political campaigns with the proceeds of extortion, drug trafficking, and kidnapping. So there are people who say that in Colombia, don't worry, the FARC will never win any elections because the Colombian people don't want them. It's true, we reject them. But it is also true that with many of the rules set forth in the peace agreement, they are allowed to promote something that has a very attractive name, which is democratic participation of communities. But when you read the fine print, you see that this democratic participation binds them to I wonder if somebody's protesting my remarks. So what's the agreement include? Social protests. And I mean, many people will say, but that's part of democracy. Of course it is. But it's one thing to have an open channel for social protest, and another thing is to incite some communities to devote themselves to social protests. That engages many resources because it prevents progress. And if you continue to insist on social protests with the FARC resources, what are we going to see in a very short period of be able to put together a populist coalition with the Communist Party, Marcha Patriótica, and several movements to bring Colombia to the tragedy that we've seen in Venezuela for the past 16 years and that other countries have experienced. Unfortunately, they're emerging from it now. They're freeing themselves from it, like in Argentina and Bolivia. So what we don't want to see is Colombia to move towards the populism that is so damaging. We want peace, of course we do, but what we can in no way accept is that when you ask for the rule of law, then we get called enemies of peace. In my case, I want the peace of Colombia more than anything. And many people have said, here's what we've said for 20 years, strengthening institutions, defend justice, economic development. As President Biden was saying, it's not sustainable to have a democracy without economic development and without the rule of law. And that is what we want to have for Colombia. We want this negotiating process should not bring us to political populism with the tremendous disadvantage of the drug traffickers' money and other illegal proceeds to allow them to participate in politics when the FARC is at a great advantage over other political parties. Yes, I'm sorry, we have 2 more panelists and we just have 15 minutes left, and I also want to allow time for question and answer very briefly. This is occurring at a time when Colombian institutions are at their lowest point of prestige. Today, there is repudiation. Some 70% of the people are rejecting the current administration and the system of justice, and there's also a rejection of some 79% rejection of political parties, and also 73% rejection of our Congress. So if we look at our institutions, we see that there is a tremendous risk here. And with this agreement, I'm going to finish here, Patricia, we see that the full agreement will become part of the constitutional bloc. And in the future, this agreement will not be able to be changed. So the advantages set forth in the agreement for the FARC are advantages that if the plebiscite passes, then they will remain as part of our constitution. In other words, the FARC will incorporate their political platform into the Colombian constitution with a national budget resources for the coming 20 years. That is our concern. We want to bring the good, save the good things out of this agreement that are valid and important, but there are things that we are concerned about that are also very important. So I was just wondering whether it is possible to renegotiate the agreement if the no wins, which is a remote possibility and now according to certain surveys, but recent surveys have the yes winning. But now I'd like to talk with Minister Wagner about these new challenges faced by the Peruvian government. It is a very left-leaning government, but they respect the rules of the market. It has been welcomed by the business sector, the private sector. We're seeing a major change in the immediate and future administration of President Kuczynski, which is just getting started. We would like to hear an overview from you about the challenges now and in the future. Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much to Enrique for the invitation, and also Michael. I thank you. I wish to congratulate both of you on this 20th anniversary of the annual CAF conference. And I also congratulate Enrique for his wonderful 25 years at the helm of this model financial institution in our region. Now, to respond to Patricia's questions, I'd like to point out that Peru has just elected the 4th a consecutive democratic president, something that had never occurred before in Peru, 4 consecutive democratic terms. And this, for us, is an important point in the path to strengthening democracy in our country. In 2001, Alejandro Toledo was elected. 2006, Alan Garcia for his 2nd term. 2011, Ollanta Humala, and now in 2016, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. But at the same time, I wish to underscore the fact that throughout this long 15-year period, we have essentially maintained economic policies of macroeconomic stability, openness to markets, and allowing the market to operate. These 2 things together, democratic stability with many flaws that we are working on a day-to-day basis, and also a good, stable economic management has created something wonderful in Peru. We not only have a very high rate of growth, of course strengthened by the good performance of our commodity prices, but also we have a good internal economic stability. And this has led to a significant drop in poverty in our country. We've gone from some 70% of the population in poverty to just 29%. President Kuczynski has laid out some concrete objectives for strengthening this model. For example, it has been proposed that for 2020, by 2021, we want to reduce population from 22 to 15%, and for rural poverty, down to 9%, and to also eradicate extreme poverty. These are important targets to reach in the next 5 years. Another important problem we face in Peru is the high number of people working in the informal economy. 70% of our workers are in the informal sector. What has been proposed by President Kuczynski is that by the end of his term in 2021, 60% will be in the formal sector. This is extremely important because it also means changing our economy. It's not the same to have an economy that works with 30% of the population in the formal sector than it is to have 60% of that population in the formal sector. This means that 60% of the population will have rights that they do not enjoy today. For example, the right to health care, to the social safety net, etc. So these are very important things. And furthermore, we plan to achieve it by promoting medium and small enterprises and by simplifying the tax system, for example, for small businesses. We also are going to try to free up investments that had been held back. There are $18 billion in investments that are being held up in the area of mining. And President Kuczynski has proposed that in 2 years we can free up this investment by reaching social agreements with the communities in the areas that are affected by these mining projects. And unfortunately, President Humala's administration was not able to do this. President Humala decided that that was a problem between these private enterprises and the peasant communities, and that the government had no role to play in this. So this was a way to simply evade the problem, and these investments continue to be blocked up. And now the president plans to serve as a mediator to reach a solution. And there's another very important thing, which is the elimination of many of the obstacles that have been placed in the way of investment in recent years. So in other words, what we are proposing in large measure is to pick up the pace of the economy after growing on average over the last 10 years at 8%. And there were years in which we had more than 10% growth. At present, well, this year we expected to close the year at about 3.8%, more or less. And for next year, it's expected that growth might be a bit more than 4%. So what we're trying to do here is to achieve the potential level of growth that our economy is believed to have now, which is 5% if things go well. And so for me, henceforth, the result of the investments, which are essential not only foreign investment, but also essentially national investment. And we also have to see how this also is contingent on how the world economy performs. Yes, in terms of foreign policy, very briefly. Yes, please, very briefly. The first principle, we just have 8 minutes left. First, we're going to look at respect for democracy and human rights, strengthen relations with our neighbors, support integration of all forms, particularly the TPP, and to project ourselves towards the Pacific, which is an area in which we have natural allies. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, it will be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is growing and strengthening and plans to achieve what many other integration systems have not been able to do. Mr. Peña, you have less than 7 minutes, so now we're going to speak a little bit about Argentina, I imagine.
Yes, we're going to be talking about Argentina, and I will make a contribution so we have time for at least one question. I'll be very brief. It's not because there's nothing new happening in Argentina. There is, and there always will be. But I wanted to contribute to today's debate and underline 3 issues that I think are important to monitor in Argentina. The first one has to do with political governance, and clearly, not only from the standpoint of the president or the current administration, but from political parties, the key thing is elections next year. Why? Because the president came to power with almost a tie. For the first time in Argentina, there was a situation where there wasn't one political party with a lot of power over everyone else. And from the political standpoint, that may be good news. Now, in parliamentary elections next year, according to the results, we may wind up with a government that may be hard to govern, but the good part about this complicated piece of news is that the government has shown, and I think will continue to show, that it is good at establishing partnerships. When in a democracy there is almost a tie, that's good news. Then the second priority, and here in this room there are a lot of specialists that can tell you about Argentina's economy. But another bright spot is our economy. We have had recurring traditional problems. You'd have to go back a long way, perhaps to the time of the first conference held by CAF, but I'm not going to go back that far. Now, our economy, like most economies in the world, is being affected by things that are happening worldwide. And to this, we add the fact that the economy that we are most linked to, which is Brazil's economy, is also going through hard times. Now, we are certain that Brazil will be able to put those minor problems aside. And then my third point is the international setting. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to talk about what's happening internationally. That is where you find elements that show that our country, that is a country that has often been so attached to the past, like other countries in the world today, especially in Europe. I don't want to get into problems here with the conference organizers, but my country is now looking to the future. They're looking at who to work with to design a better future. And I think that that is something that's going to have an effect on the region. And there are things going on in 3 fronts. Now that I'm talking about the international dimension of the current administration's policy, is that, first of all, they're focusing on the region. This is obvious. They're looking at the role played by Argentina in the hemisphere, especially in Mercosur, where we work closely with Brazil and other countries. And right now, this is very tied to what was established by the government of Chile a couple of years ago, the idea of convergence and diversity. And that means that it's only natural for us to continue to work with that country too, especially now that we're focusing on the Pacific Alliance and other countries in the region. Then the other item has to do with our role in the world. And I think that the good thing is that we can boil this down to one aspect, and that is we need to negotiate. We have to have relations with all possible countries. Now, the foreign minister of Argentina has been very clear on this, and the president in his meetings, his schedule, last week, for example, he was in China, and I think that this is going to have a positive effect on our vision within the region. I think that more and more we're realizing that we can be part of a more pluralistic, a more diversified world. And then the third item that I think we're working on and that we will continue to address is we need to renew. We need to do something new in a world where everything is becoming obsolete. We can't be tied to paradigms of how we worked with other countries in terms of trade, our customs agreements. There's a lot there that's antiquated, and I think that we need to work on that. Hopefully, the World Trade Organization will hold a conference in Uruguay, at least that's close to us. And in 2020, there will be a meeting where we will all have a lot to contribute on how we want to design our future. So I think that that's good news. And Patricia, I know it seems like I lied. I said I wouldn't be too long. Well, My suggestion is that we allow 2 questions, and I promise that our panelists will be brief. I don't know if there is a microphone that we can get to the speaker here. Yes, a short question for the former Minister of Defense of Brazil. In her defense, the president said that those who accused her, they have corruption trials going on against them. Now, what would your response be to that argument brought by the former president? Are there those trials regarding corruption? Could you please clarify that?
Process against President Dilma has nothing to do with corruption. That's not the issue. It's about managing the federal budget. I mean, corruption is linked to the party and what they call petrolão, the political leaders in the Workers' Party, and their charges against them, corruption, with also linked to the oil company. Now, the Brazilian Democratic Movement, the second largest party in Brazil, has certain leaders that are being investigated. The investigation process in Brazil continues very without problems. Now, the impeachment trial has nothing to do with corruption. That was an impeachable crime committed, or in other words, a crime of responsibility in the management of the budget.
One more question. We promised only 2 questions. So please go ahead.
My question is for Shannon. It's very well known that the U.S. is championing democracy around the world, especially in our hemisphere. So my question is, does the U.S. consider Venezuela as a democracy? Thank you.
It's a wonderful question, and thank you, Sonia. The answer is Venezuela isn't a democracy under extraordinary stress and crisis. And as I noted before, fights for political power today take place within democratic institutions. And the great tragedy of Venezuela is that the political fight for power and the fight to keep power is having a corroding and tremendously damaging impact on Venezuelan institutions. And this is why it's so important to find a way to address this, why it's so important to open space for the Venezuelan people to express themselves. Because at the end of the day, democratic institutions are not designed to repress, they're designed to express. And in this regard, the point I made earlier about solidarity and about the region looking for ways to help Venezuela address this crisis is so important, because a political crisis has become an economic crisis, which has become a humanitarian crisis, and the cost for the Venezuelan people is huge.
Gracias, embajador. Desafortunadamente.
Thank you, Ambassador. Unfortunately, I was told that we had to conclude now because the agenda continues and we have an excellent program ahead of us. So I wanted to thank all of you for your participation. Unfortunately, we didn't have the 3 hours that we would have liked to have had to enter into detail, but we still have a day and a half left to engage in an in-depth conversation about the immediate future of this region. Thank you.
¿Estás hasta cuándo?